titled Game Changers, How CAR-T and Cell Therapy are Revolutionizing Cancer Immunotherapy. Before I turn the program over to our presenters, I would like to go over some quick housekeeping items with everyone. First, today's program will last approximately 60 minutes. We do encourage you to submit written questions throughout the program. And if you do have a question, please type the question into the Q&A widget open on the left-hand side of your screen. We will respond to written questions at the end of the program, time permitting. Should we run out of time to address questions, we will follow up with individuals via email following the program. The webcast console you're looking at can be completely customized. You can resize or move any of the windows that you have open, including maximizing the PowerPoint presentation on your screen. If you experience technical difficulties at any point during the presentation, please visit the webcast help guide by clicking on the help button below the presentation window, which is designated with a question mark icon. A PDF copy of today's presentation slides is available for immediate download via the resource list widget open on the left-hand side of your screen. This PDF and an audio recording of today's presentation will also be available for download from the Foley.com website within the next few business days. And in addition, Foley will apply for CLE credit after today's web conference. If you did not already supply your CLE information upon registering, please send an email to me. My name is Allison Jones. My email address is ajones@foley.com. That's AJONES@foley.com. And in your email, please include your state bar and license number. To be eligible for CLE, you will need to be logged into this On24 platform for the duration of the session and also answer a polling question with a 5-digit course code that I will announce during the program. In addition to answering the polling question, those who are seeking Kansas, New York, and/or New Jersey CLE credit are required to complete an attorney affirmation form, which is available for download via the resource list widget. It's also available via the reminder email you all should have received yesterday, but if you have questions, again, please email me. Include the 5-digit course code on that completed form as well, and return the form to me via email following the program. From there, certificates of attendance will be distributed to eligible participants approximately 8 weeks after the web conference via email. And as a final note, at the conclusion of this program, a survey will appear on your screen. Please take a minute or two to provide your feedback about the presentation today. It is important to us to know your thoughts, which helps us shape our future programs. So with that, thank you, and I will now turn the program over to our first presenter, Steve.
Thank you, Allison, and welcome everybody. I'm Steve Mabius, an IP partner in the Washington office of Foley and Lardner. And before we begin, I just want to offer a brief disclaimer on behalf of our presenters today. These views that we're presenting represent our own personal views and shouldn't be attributed to our respective employers or any of our clients. And today we have a group of speakers who's going to cover several different areas, and I'd like to briefly introduce them right now. Richard Warburg is going to be providing a business and investor perspective as well as insights that he's developed in his role as a founder and head of Godney Holdings, LLC, as a manager of new ventures, and also as a managing director at Oven Therapeutics. So he's got a number of roles that will allow him to provide insight from a business point of view into the immunotherapy area as well as IP. We also have Crystal Shore, who's a partner in the Kymriah group, which she chairs at Foley and Lardner. Crystal's going to cover the IP side of CAR-T and immunotherapy today. And next we'll have Nate Beaver, who's a partner in our FDA practice group at Foley, to talk about the regulatory pathways and FDA strategy relating to CAR-T and cell therapy. And then also we have Judy Waltz, who's a partner in our healthcare group, and she's going to talk about the insurance reimbursement and pricing strategy relating to these new technologies. I'm going to go over a couple more slides before I turn it over to Richard. For our agenda today, we're going to start, as I mentioned, with the investment landscape, and then we're going to go into IP issues that impact immunotherapy and CAR-T. We're going to follow that with discussion about regulatory pathways at the FDA that will impact the ultimate market success of CAR-T and new emerging immunotherapy. And we'll finish up with a discussion of reimbursement pricing strategies and how we expect that may impact the market for these new technologies. So let's start with an overview of the immunotherapy landscape and how these exciting new technologies fit into it. I'm sure that most of us have heard about the incredible promise of these recently approved therapies, Kymriah and Yescarta, that are the first FDA-approved CAR-T therapies in the U.S. for cancer. And I think it helps to understand the overall framework into which they fit. And really that starts with monoclonal antibody therapies. Some of the areas that were developed earliest in the immunotherapy space involve monoclonal antibodies, including those which are being used as immune checkpoint inhibitors. And some examples of those are anti-PD-1 antibodies such as nivolumab and pembrolizumab. We also have another more recently emerging area relating to antibody drug conjugates, where the antibody is joined in some way to a drug moiety. And examples of those would be Cadcycla, trastuzumab monoclonal antibody, which is conjugated to an anti-cancer agent, emtansine. Some of the other types of antibodies that are used in immunotherapy are bispecific or multispecific antibodies. An example of that is blinatumomab, which targets CD19 and CD3, and is a way of bringing immune cells in close contact with cancer cells. So it's against this backdrop of these traditional antibody therapies that we now have cell therapy, including T-cell and CAR-T cells, which have been modified in some way to boost their immune effects. And the two recent examples we have are Kymriah and Yescarta, which are modified T-cells directed against CD19. So to summarize some other important aspects of this technology, CAR-T therapy is individualized for single patients, and it's administered a single time. And that's both a challenge and an opportunity. It's a challenge in the sense that each therapy has to be individually manufactured for that patient, and it's a great opportunity to more effectively treat patients because it is so highly customized. Whereas traditional immunotherapies based on antibodies are given to larger patient populations, and they require multiple courses of treatment over time. Another important point to consider is that some of the traditional antibody-based immunotherapies are now facing or will soon face biosimilar competition. So that may have an impact on pricing. One example of that is Herceptin, where the first biosimilar was recently approved by the FDA. This next slide is just to show excerpts from the labels of Kymriah and Adcetris, which is a traditional antibody-based immunotherapy. And just to give you a sense of how the labels differ, and as well as the price, which I've showed in the lower left corner of the slide. the full course of treatment with Adcetris averages around $100,000, whereas Kymriah, which is given only one time, is currently priced at $475,000. Both of these products carry warnings, and you'll hear some discussion today about the side effect profiles and how that may impact the success in the marketplace of various products. So we see that the emerging CAR-T therapies carry a higher price tag, but they have a number of benefits by only requiring a single treatment. And in addition to that, they've been developed for treatment in patients for whom all other therapeutic options have failed. Some of the open questions are, will cost of production decline with new technology? Will it become easier for companies to manufacture individualized patient CAR-T therapy? Will there be new technologies that allow companies to more accurately control the dosing level or the point at which the therapeutic cells reach their targets to improve safety profile? Another question is, how will pricing approaches impact success, and what new types of pricing will be adopted? For example, will people look to patient outcomes as a way to determine what the pricing should be? And lastly, how will improving antibody and antibody drug conjugate therapy impact the overall immunotherapy market, as well as the biosimilars that are being developed to compete with them? So with that brief introduction, I would like to turn it over to Richard Warburg, who will now cover the investment landscape.
Thank you very much, Steve. It's a pleasure to be on this august panel. My background is originally in molecular biology, and then postdocing in the United States, and working my way into becoming a patent attorney, and then turning from the patent attorney to be a member of two august venture-type funds or private equity funds, with whom I'm working now. I don't know. So first of all, let me just state that up front, I am involved significantly in the ADC technology area, particularly in the founding of ADC Therapeutics, which is a PBD-based ADC. PBDs are exquisitely toxic, and when you put them onto an antibody, they zoom off to the cancers and will kill them, even if they're not dividing. If they start to divide later, it'll catch them at that point. I was previously involved with Spirogen, which was then sold in October 2013 to AstraZeneca and MedImmune, developing a similar sort of technology. So what I'd like to do today is provide an outline of the business perspective of the facts that you look for when you're making investments, including such companies as ADCT, with Stemcentrx, which use the same technology as ADCT but different antibodies. The AstraZeneca, Seattle Genetics also is using ADCs with a slightly different warhead, although they're moving now into the PBD area, as is Genentech and others. And also looking at companies which are focused on CAR-T, including the Kite, which is acquired by Gilead, Juno, Novartis, and others. The facts that are relevant to looking at the potential for investing in any particular company are based on what's been going on in the last year. So, for example, Stemcentrx was acquired for about $10 billion by AbbVie in 2016, and that is based on the lead drug, which is called Reva-T, which, just like at ADCT, is based on a PBD technology targeting the DLL and showing efficacy in small cell lung cancer, where the median survival is less than 1 year. This drug was rather exquisite in its ability to help stabilize the disease, with 68% of patients getting stable disease and 18% even showing a reduction in tumor size. And if you're overexpressor of the DLL3, you actually see much larger numbers of 89% and 39%. And if it's a third line of treatment, in other words, the patients have tried very hard to get rid of the disease and failed with prior drugs, you're getting treatment levels of stabilization of 92%, with 2 patients right now living as long as 18 months. The adverse effects are manageable, including rash, fluid accumulation, low platelet count, and we expect to see that there will be a BLA filed in the next few months. Another relevant fact is with Novartis and its development of our CAR-T. As Steve said, there was approval of the Kymriah this year for patients up to 25 years old, and it's being sold for B-cell precursor acute lymphoblastic leukemia at a cost of $475K. They have spectacular rates of remission as well, of 83%, compared to what was a usual 10% survival for 5 years. This is being developed through a network of centers so that they're being trained for the use in the therapy. It is a one-time treatment, but the adverse effects are rather large as well. 49%, or about 50% of patients have grade 3 or 4, which is the highest level of side effects, including cytokine release syndrome. And that's when Steve showed you the label. There is a black box labeling, or risk evaluation mitigation strategy labeling. In some cases, there are companies which have given up on their CAR-T program, including Juno, after 2 patient deaths. Other facts are Kite, which was acquired very recently for $12 billion by Gilead. They're developing the same sort of technology as with Novartis, where you're taking specific cells and empowering the immune system to recognize and kill the tumors. The BLA was submitted for Yescarta for large B-cell lymphoma in patients who failed at least 2 prior treatments, and they asked for priority review. And it actually was not only priority review, but they were the FDA moved so quickly, it was approved 6 weeks earlier than had been expected. In Europe, they've submitted similar papers for similar indications. The response rate, again, is very high, a 72% response rate, 51% seeing complete remission. And there's a median follow-up now of 8 months, although, of course, that number will grow. They did see 4 fatalities, with 3 related to the CAR-T. But despite what happened with Juno, they did continue. They also have the REMS box labeling, and the cost is $375K. Now, you've got to take into account when you're looking at ADCs and CAR-Ts that ADCs, in the scheme of things, while they're biologics, are relatively straightforward from a CMC point of view for production. While you have multiple dosing with ADCs, you're likely to have only 1 dose for the CAR-T technology. The ADCs, however, can be used for multiple different patients. In other words, you select the patient based on what antigens they have, whether it be CD19, for example, or CD30, or whatever it might be. That group of patients, you would hope, would react to those ADCs, just as we discussed before with Stemcentrx, where the higher number of antigens that the antibody is specific for, the better results you're getting. With CAR-T, it takes 17 days to take the cells out, re-engineer them for the patient, and then put them back in. And it's really said to be, it's only for patients who've run out of options, because the side effect profile is so high, including death, which is kind of extreme. And the technology itself, even though successful, may make you liable or vulnerable to infections later on in life. And those are adverse effects that might continue throughout one's life. So what factors would you consider in assessing long-term prospects of these sort of investments? One is, first and foremost, which was answered relatively recently, is will the FDA approve the therapy? And of course it has for Kite and for others. And is this a platform technology? In other words, if you invest in a company, is it just a one-drug deal? Or is it a platform of different antibodies in the case of Stemcentrx, but it wasn't just Rova-T. They had a whole series of antibody-drug conjugates coming in the pipeline. The other question is CMC. Is it easy to do? Can you do it effectively? Can you do it reproducibly? Will the FDA keep on questioning whether you're doing it properly, and will you be able to survive because of that? And finally, you also want to look at the value of the IP, which will be addressed in the next talk by Crystal. You look at the protection that's obtained for being a biologic for 12 years. But ask yourself, is that protection going to give you any value at all in the technology? For example, with ADCs, it's great protection because you can specify exactly what the antibody is and exactly what the warhead is. But with CAR-T, the initial portion of, can we call it a drug, is going to differ from one patient to another. And so, yes, you can say what it is from one patient to another, but you can't say, how do I now obtain that biologic protection to stop other third parties coming in? If you're going to characterize either of these as a new chemical entity, of course, you get the 5 years in the US and 10 in Europe and Japan, but everybody's going for biologic protection for BLA as opposed to an NCE, so that probably doesn't affect it here. The other is, can you protect the product that is sold or used by the doctor? Can you get a patent on the actual product? Most people prefer to have protection at that level as opposed to getting it only at the method of treatment level. Method of treatment in this case, who's doing the treatment? How is it being performed? Are you going to have to end up suing doctors, which tends to be frowned upon? How are you going to police the technology? When you're using ADCs, you know exactly where it's going to be used. But if, say, somebody goes off and develops the CAR-T technology in a country where you don't have patent protection and takes the cells and then ships the cells back after treatment for insertion into the patient, are you going to prevent that from happening? And will you even know if it's happening? And if the insertion into the patient is also done in that same country, will you know about it and can you avoid it? So one has to ask, with CAR-T, maybe the hurdle is too high for other countries to use it because the technology is so tricky to use. With ADCs, perhaps you need a much broader patent filing in order to give yourself that protection. And finally, are there any trade secrets that might prevent competition? We've talked about the nasty side effects. If you develop a way of making the CAR-T technology that reduces side effects, that could go a long way to making sure that you're the entity that it's gone to and you keep that as a secret. What other factors would you consider? It's whether you can, what is the cost of treatment? Is that going to be worthwhile in the investment? And are you going to get reimbursed? Because if you're not getting reimbursed, you may well think that that's not much of an investment. And the other is it a first line or later treatment? The more close you can get, if that's the right grammar, to a first line, the more likely you are to get it to you. If it's a later line treatment, of course, your percentage of patients goes down significantly, and that affects the money side of things. What is the opportunity for off-label use? Will people use the ADCs, for example, for other treatments, which is quite likely because doctors are not restricted as to how they can use the medicines. With CAR-T, it might be more difficult because the doctors realize how expensive it might be and what the risk might be, and they're sticking their neck out much more than usual. And finally, can you sell a kit or use a central lab? If you've got a kit, then you've got something you can go after clear IP protection on. If you've got a central lab, you're setting the bar higher for other people to compete with you, because then you can at least get patent protection that will go after the central lab as opposed to individual doctors. So how do you value companies when the price for treatment is at $355K versus lower prices of, I think Steve was saying, at $100K for some of the ADCs? I think the answer is that this is not without precedent. Orphan drugs have been priced as high as $840K a year, not just a one-off treatment, but for a year. 29 of those are at $336K for a year. And in most cases, there's no alternative but to use those orphan drugs. And those are getting reimbursement, those are getting funded. Those are actually very valuable companies to invest in. What if the payment is only made if the patient survives? How does that affect the math? Because now you're looking at saying, all right, we're going to do X number of treatments, and maybe only a portion of those are going to survive, and we only get paid on a portion of those. Will the money work out? Will we be going into a negative cash situation? What if the reimbursement is made only if the patient has the right antigen? So with the Stemcentrx example, where you have DLL3, if that patient doesn't have DLL3 antigen on it, are you still going to get reimbursement? Or is it only if the treatment is successful? Is it going to be a cure, or is it going to increase chances of survival? This is weighing the issue of how much is it worth to keep a person alive for another month versus the whole life expectancy. What's the adverse profile on it? Is this a quality of life with or without treatment? Are they going to have to live in a bubble because they are now immunosuppressed? What's going to happen? How is that going to affect the valuation on the company? Are there other alternatives, other companies developing alternatives to what we're trying to sell? And ask yourself also, the market in the last year has shown that the price for an ADC and for CAR-T companies such as Stemcentrx and Kite are very similar. It was $10 billion or $11 billion versus $12 billion. And then will the new gene editing techniques that are coming in, for example, as CRISPR, will those change the effect on pricing, on the valuation? Will they become competitive? My feeling right now is it's unlikely because the amount of genetic changes that are made which you cannot understand that will be in there. It won't be just a single genetic change. There could be other that could cause side effects, and the FDA will not want to approve them. And so will reimbursement models accommodate these prices? I'm going to leave that for a later speaker, but you can see the bullet points here, so I don't want to run over on my time. So let me, at this point, introduce you to Crystal Short, who will discuss intellectual property. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. So in recognizing the importance of immunotherapy and in support of the White House's billion-dollar initiative to do 10 years' worth of cancer research in the next 5 years, the USPTO created an initiative to accelerate immunotherapy-related patent applications through the U.S. Patent Office. This program is called the Cancer Immunotherapy Pilot Program. It's also known as Patents for Patients. And applications, the idea is that applications relating to immunotherapy can be advanced out of turn, so accorded special status with the filing of a petition. The goal is to cut the time that it takes to review patent applications that relate to immunotherapy by half. The notice says it would be 1 year to reach a final written decision from the grant of the special status petition. And in our discussions with the Patent Office, it seems that the Patent Office has been able to get most, if not all, the applications to a final decision within 1 year. So if the application contains one or more claims to a method of treating cancer using immunotherapy, that application is eligible for this immunotherapy pilot program. Now, the application has to contain a treatment method. It cannot be a composition, even if that composition is inherently used for immunotherapy. The timing of the petition is that it has to be filed in a case where the application has not yet been acted on, or it is accompanied with an RCE request. There's one exception that relates to an ongoing IND, but for the most part, it is before there's been a first office action on the merits. So some other requirements are that that there are 3 independent claims, no more than 20 claims total, that there are no multiply dependent claims, and that if there is a restriction requirement, you're agreeing to a telephonic restriction without traverse. Applications that have been granted special status under other USPTO procedures, such as PPH, accelerated examination, Track 1, those other programs, those applications would not then be eligible to be made special under the immunotherapy pilot program. This pilot program has been extended to December of 2018. It was originally set to expire in June of 2017, but due to the success of the program, it has been extended, and the petitions now have to be filed on or before December 31st. This should say 2018. The USPTO can then decide later whether it wishes to extend the program further or terminate the program. It just depends on the effectiveness of the program. Now, from a strategic perspective, you want to first consider whether to file a patent application or keep the invention as a trade secret. Some reasons to keep the invention as a trade secret, as Richard had alluded to earlier, is to keep a competitive advantage. So you can decide to not file a patent application, so not disclose any aspect of your invention, and the downside is you would not get patent protection. Or you can file a patent application, but withhold certain information that is relevant to your competitive advantage. Of course, that type of disclosure still needs to be a complete enabling disclosure and meet all the other requirements for patentability under the U.S. patent laws, but you can still have an enabling disclosure that leaves out some details that are advantageous from a competitive perspective. Also, another thing to consider is whether the infringement activities would even be known. So if the infringement activities are to occur, but they wouldn't be detectable in the product, or one would otherwise not be able to show that the infringement activity occurred, and this could happen with claims to aspects of a method, then it may weigh against filing a patent application if you could never identify an infringer. Another factor that would weigh against an application is if no single infringer could be identified. So if the claims could not be written so that there is a single infringer. I don't believe that would be the case here with CAR T cells and methods of making them and methods of using them, but it is a consideration. Another consideration would be whether the claims that can be drafted are just so narrow that there's an opportunity for a competitor to design around its product and therefore then get around the claims. So ideally you would want to write claims as broadly as possible. Also, and this is also briefly mentioned by Richard, you would want to consider whether aspects of the method claims, if that's what was patented, could be separated and performed in different countries so that the claims would then not be infringed. So, for example, obtaining the cells from the patient in the U.S. and sending the cells off to another country where there is no relevant patent for the product to be made. If you do decide to file an application, a patent application, and you are then pursuing the application outside of the U.S., you'd want to also then consider whether to include markets where there is CAR T research and development activities, U.S., Asia, Canada, but also other emerging markets. If you do decide to file a patent application, you could choose to pursue claims that are directed to a manufacturing method, such as preparation of cells, manufacturing the CAR T cells, improved methods relating to CAR T cells, as was stated earlier, other gene editing technologies such as CRISPR are being used in CAR T cells. You'd want to consider all the aspects of the manufacturing method and break them down to see if you can claim sections of that methodology that can also help prevent someone from designing around the claims to a manufacturing method. Other things to claim would be compositions. So, of course, the CAR T cells themselves, whether it's a new construct or a new target, on-off switches, modifications that were made to the CAR T cells for optimization of efficacy or production. An expanded population of CAR T cells, those can also be claimed. With regard to method of treatment, of course, your basic method of treatment claims can be pursued, as well as dosing regimens, how the product is administered, so aspects relating to the treatment, not just a method of treating a patient. The mechanism of action claims can also be pursued, so claims to a mechanism of action using the specific product. This slide just gives a general overview. It was prepared a few months back, so around May or so of this year, so it's slightly old, but I imagine the trend is about the same. Where are the patents being filed? WO is the biggest one, so the PCT, the international application. The US, Australia, China, Europe, Canada, Japan, Korea, Singapore, Mexico, Taiwan, Israel, and Hong Kong, in that order of abundance of applications. So it's expanding, and in a number of different countries. And lastly, the biggest filers of these patent applications, University of Pennsylvania, of course, and I believe they have a collaboration with Novartis, Selectis, Sloan Kettering, to name a few of them. So next, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague at Foley, Nate Beaver, who will address the regulatory issues with CAR T cells.
Thanks, Crystal, and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nate Beaver. I'm a partner with Foley here in our Washington, D.C. office. I'm going to be touching on the FDA regulatory approval and pathway issues associated with these two recent CAR T product approvals. They did both go through and have been treated as biologics by FDA, so both went through the biologic license application approval process, as we've discussed. Novartis's Kymriah and Kite Pharma, now purchased by Gilead, Yescarta's product. I'll talk about there was both an accelerated development as well as an accelerated approval process, and talk about some of the pathway initiatives that were utilized for these products. And as others have talked about, there are certainly great rewards in the manner of the efficacy of these products, but also significant patient risks. And I'll touch briefly on both the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, as well as post-marketing studies that have been put into place for both of these products. So the indications for use, I just want to touch on briefly. For Kymriah, this is a B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia, so-called ALL, that is refractory or in second or later relapse. And this is for pediatric patients and young adult patients up to the age of 25. For Yescarta, you see treatment of adult patients with relapsed or refractory large B-cell non-Hodgkin lymphoma in patients for whom at least two other types of treatment for their blood cancer have failed. So part of the issue here with respect to efficacy is there are significant amounts of efficacy for these products, but they're not first-line treatments they're really when other treatments have failed. With respect to the development and approval process, we can just see based on the submittal and approval dates here, which I've included here, both were submitted early in 2017 this year, and you see the approval times of just under 7 months for each product, 6 months, 28 days for Kymriah, and 6 months, 18 days for Yescarta. Giving a little more context to that and what I thought would be helpful is looking at the development timeline plan here. You see from the date of IND submission in September of 2014 down to the PDUFA action due date of 10/3/2017, with the approval coming in August of 13, that this truly was an accelerated and expedited both approval and review process. I think other areas of interest here, and I'll touch on later, you see a number of exclusivities and different grants which would have been associated with this expedited review, an orphan designation, rare disease designation, as well as breakthrough therapy designations for this particular product. And I would note, as expected in these types of orphan products where the patient populations are small, that in terms of the clinical trials that were conducted for these products, for Kymriah, for example, there was one multi-center study of 63 patients. So we're also talking about, relatively speaking, a limited number of patients. The development process for Yescarta, similar timelines. IND submitted in December of 2014. They received multiple orphan drug designations for the product in 2014 and 2016. A breakthrough designation was granted in December of 2015. For Yescarta, they had a rolling submission process where the first module was submitted at the end of 2016, with the final module submitted in March of 2017. Again, the PDUFA action date of 11/29, FDA was able to approve the product more quickly than that on 10/18. So again, I think it's an indication that FDA's breakthrough designation and other expedited approval processes worked well with these particular products. As I noted, significant rewards, especially from an efficacy standpoint, but also risks. For Kymriah, we see an overall remission rate within 3 months of treatment was 83%. And for Yescarta, similarly, complete remission rate after treatment was at 51%. So obviously for patients who are really obviously with significant diseases and have tried other treatments that have failed, the rewards for these products can be very, very significant. But there are risks, and those risks are certainly significant as well. As Richard touched on, both products contain so-called black box warnings related to cytokine release syndrome, so-called CRS, which is a systemic response to the activation and proliferation of CAR T cells, which can cause high fever and flu-like symptoms, and for neurological events along with other serious side effects. In addition to CRS, there were other significant side effects that were experienced with these products. As a result, one of the pieces that FDA put into place to address some of these safety risks were risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, so-called REMS, which for both products includes elements to assure safe use. For both products, FDA is requiring that hospitals and their associated clinics that dispense be specially certified. And as part of that certification, staff involved in the prescribing, dispensing, or administering of the products are required to be trained to both recognize as well as manage CRS and other nervous system toxicities. Patients as well must be informed of the potential serious side effects, now the importance of promptly returning to the treatment site if side effects do develop. Post-marketing studies were also required for both products, partly, I think, in effect to the, as I mentioned, smaller patient populations that were involved in the multi-center trials that ultimately led to approval, the post-marketing studies are quite significant. Both must conduct a multi-center study involving either 1,000 or 1,500 patients who must be enrolled within 3 months over a period of 5 years. All subjects must be followed for 15 years from the date of infusion, and final study reports for both products are due in December of 2038. We're getting a little bit of feedback. Could someone mute their line, please? Regulatory items of interest with respect to these products. Both received 12 years of biologics exclusivity, as we mentioned. There were orphan designations as well as 7-year orphan drug exclusivity for both products. And as well, under the Pediatric Research Equity Act, further pediatric studies will be waived because of the orphan designation. Both products received, as I mentioned, breakthrough designations as well as priority review. And notably, I think Kymriah also received a rare pediatric disease designation and voucher. This voucher, as you may know, is transferable. It can be sold and has been sold. There have been a handful of these that have gone on the market where that value has ranged from $67 million to $350 million. This is Novartis's second voucher, and I would expect, given the owner of that voucher and their anticipated pipeline, that one will probably not show up on the open market, but you can get a sense of the value of that designation and voucher program. Finally, with respect to FDA's support of this particular technology, I think it's notable that we have an FDA Commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, who is himself a survivor of cancer, of Hodgkin's lymphoma. I think it's no surprise that he has been actively involved and with respect to cancer products particularly. In the press release involving the approval of one of these products, he had to say that today marks another milestone in the development of what he called a whole new scientific paradigm for treatment of serious diseases. He mentioned that this approval demonstrates the continued momentum of what he described as a promising new area of medicine, and that FDA was committed to supporting and helping expedite the development of these products. So the focus not on simply expediting the approval of these products, but the development of these products as well. He touched on a comprehensive policy regarding the FDA's general support of cell-based regenerative medicines, and specifically noted that guidance will also apply how their expedited programs to breakthrough products that use CAR T cells and other gene therapies. So I think it is a demonstration of FDA's buy-in, FDA and especially Commissioner Gottlieb's personal interest in seeing that these products that can be so valuable to patients can be developed and approved in as quickly a manner as possible when appropriate. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Judy Waltz. Judy's going to talk about reimbursement and pricing of these types of products. Thank you.
Thank you, Nate. So I'm Judy Waltz. I'm from the San Francisco office of Foley, and I'm a healthcare lawyer. So I feel a little bit like I get to talk about the elephant in the room here, which is reimbursement. These drugs are expensive. You've heard the numbers as we've gone through this presentation. Kymriah is at $475,000, Yescarta at $373,000. These drugs are administered in one course of therapy, and so it's basically now or never if the product is going to be paid for. It's also important to remember that if you're talking about the course of therapy, that you're not just talking about the price of the drug. This is typically infused in a hospital setting. And one estimate that I read from a recent telecast indicated that if you are treating patients who have complications, that it's very likely that the course of treatment for Kymriah could reach close to $1 million. So that's a lot of money for payers to take on. Certainly for individuals, it is quite a bit as well. So you've heard that the other government agencies have been getting behind Kymriah. So FDA is doing its best to speed up the process. The PTO is doing what it can also to provide some protections. And CMS, which is the agency that administers Medicare and gives direction for the state Medicaid programs, CMS is also supportive. So on the day that Kymriah was approved by the FDA, CMS issued its own statement of support by way of a press release. Now it's and I used to be an attorney for CMS, so I read this with great love, obviously. But there are a lot of caveats in the CMS press release because CMS is a very highly regulated agency, and its ability to reimburse products is also heavily regulated, and maybe in particular on the drug side, very dependent on how the drug is classified, where it will be used, and many other factors. So again, CMS expressed its support in this press release. They noted the approval for pediatric patients and young adults, which is not the largest group of Medicare beneficiaries. There are some peds and young adults, primarily ESRD patients, but it's not the senior citizen category that most people think of with Medicare. So within those constraints, CMS, again, expressing its support, for the drug in particular and the concept in general, indicated they would be looking at some alternative payment mechanisms and that they expected to provide guidance at some point. I'll just end it there because they certainly did not commit to a time frame. So Novartis has been more open about their discussions than CMS has been, and from those discussions, it appears that CMS is committed to pursuing a proposal that the drug would be paid for only if it produced a successful outcome in 30 days. And we're going to go over some questions about how that was determined in just a moment. So that, from a CMS perspective, is really pretty revolutionary. The idea that payment is dependent on outcomes is one that's been tossed around for a while, but is difficult to make work in general, and especially in the context of all of CMS's parameters is even more difficult. So again, we'll get back to that in just a minute. There are other proposals that are floating around, not with CMS, but with private payers. So Express Scripts has indicated that they're considering other types of reimbursement, including payment for treatment over time, kind of like buying a house, establishing insurer risk pools that would spread the risk here, or financing one-time payments. And there are some thoughts out there about how to handle a situation where the savings to a payer would come at a later point in life. If you're curing the patient now, then they, at least hopefully you're not going to have treatment later on. So what happens when they change insurer and the one insurer got the bill and the other got the savings? How will all that be worked out, and can it be? So there are other payers now who are starting to indicate their support. I mean, this really is a wonderful product, and I think the only concern is just how to make it work in the general scheme of things. So Blue Cross Blue Shield of North Carolina has already issued its directives as to how it will pay. One of the state Medicaid programs has also indicated how it will pay. So now getting back to CMS. So as I indicated, CMS has indicated guidance will be forthcoming. They have not provided very many details. They've indicated that this is being handled through the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, CMMI, which was a creation of the Affordable Care Act. But beyond that, we don't know much. So Representative Doggett, a congressperson, recently wrote to CMS and with a list of about 14 different questions. And I think these questions are first of all, interesting. But secondly, I think they're indicative if a manufacturer is trying to design a pricing strategy. These are coming from Congress and are indicative of where their thought process is going. We've heard a lot, particularly in the last 3 or 4 years, about how to control the price of drugs going forward. And I've been surprised that the administration has not been more assertive on that front in the last year. Based on some of their comments in January, I thought this was going to be a high priority that has not resurfaced really since then. So these questions, again, I just want to run through them quickly. How many patients are involved on the Medicare side? With the peds and the young adults, the number presumably is going to be relatively small. They want to know how it was determined that the 1 month period was appropriate to look for a response. They wanted to know about how one would determine that there had been success at that 1 month outcome period. They want to know how CMS is going to track their savings, the cost avoidance down the line by pursuing this treatment. They wanted to know how CMS planned to measure their success through this program. They wanted to know how patient data was going to be collected by CMS. Presumably the manufacturer would have some, although even that may be difficult given the other care entities that are involved. They wanted to know when CMS thought they'd be ready to go on this, which is always a question people are asking of CMS. They were asking whether or not CMS was going to implement this through both Medicare and Medicaid, which is interesting because, we won't get into that. I don't think that CMS would have too much ability to require coverage through Medicaid, but that's kind of a peripheral point. They wanted to know if Novartis would be paid at the outset for the drug and then have to refund or after the success had been demonstrated. They wanted to know if the Novartis profit margin had been considered. They wanted to, this was an interesting one for me, they wanted to know if there had been some recognition of the grants that the U.S. had given over time to Novartis as they were doing their research. And then they wanted to know who was involved in making this determination. They wanted to know if Novartis was going to charge the same to the federal healthcare programs as it would to other entities. And they also wanted to know their general pricing strategy. And they wanted to know if CMS was willing to consider the use of royalty-free rights on the patents to enable more supply and lower prices. And that one I'd be willing to bet CMS had never even considered. So in general, there are more ongoing discussions. This product actually, and the idea of an outcomes-based reimbursement may actually focus the whole discussion of value-based pricing for various drugs. It's been floated for many years, but there are difficulties with how to make it work. So among the recommendations from this knee-high white paper that is very recent is that data collection is needed, specific outcome measures for patient outcomes are necessary. They look for the FDA to finalize their guidance on the exchange of information for new and not yet approved products. So knee-high also suggests that off-label information could be helpful. There are also, as part of the reimbursement consequences, there are compliance and discounts and things of that sort that can implicate the Office of Inspector General. So according to knee-high, there's a need for some new anti-kickback safe harbors to support value-based contracting. They also note that if some patients are being charged zero because they didn't have a good outcome, that may impact the price reporting for best price, which is how some Medicaid programs are supposed to get the best price that anybody gets on drugs, and so how all this implicates that is another concern. And then they also recommend that there just be some further thought given to how to finance these high-cost therapies, just because a value-based contract is just not going to solve all the issues. So with that, I think there are no easy answers on pricing strategy, but I think that a manufacturer can look at these factors that have been identified and at least be prepared with answers going forward on those. So with that, I have one more slide on the challenges of value-based pricing. And again, the same kinds of things here. These are the challenges. And note this was before Kymriah and its outcome-based approach. So looking at your data, looking at the use of list prices, which at the end of the day often have little to do with what payers actually pay for a drug. They also note the problems of modeling when you have drug prices that will fall over time. So how you capture where those drugs will go in the future in terms of pricing and reimbursement and model that into your current data is certainly challenging. This also notes that when you make a presentation to a payer, you're using existing data, and by the time the insurance coverage kicks in, it's basically based on outdated data. And also the need for transparency in price modeling. So again, these are areas of focus as a price strategy is developed. And with that, I'm going to turn it back to Allison for some CLE information.
Thanks so much, Judy, and apologies, everyone. We're running a couple minutes over here today, but lots of information to partake in. So as Judy mentioned, I'm going to go ahead and do the CLE polling question right now so we can get you guys on your way in a little bit here. I'm going to be reading a 5-digit code. It's a mixture of letters and numbers, so be sure to pay close attention. And after I read that, the polling question slide will appear on your screen where you can enter in the 5-digit code. And that will be up for about a minute. So if for some reason that form goes away before you have a chance to input the code, please go ahead and just input the code into the Q&A widget at the bottom of your screen, and we'll capture the information that way. So as a reminder for anyone seeking credit in Kansas, New York, or New Jersey, please, in addition to filling out the code here in the polling question, please be sure to enter the code on the attorney affirmation form as well and send that back to me. My email address is in the slide materials as well as the invitation materials, so that should be not a problem. But again, my email address is ajones@foley.com. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and read the code, and I will flip over to the polling question form. So the 5-digit code is the letter M as in Mary, followed by the numbers 1694. Again, that's the letter M as in Mary, and the numbers 1694. So we'll take just a moment and give you guys some time to enter that question, and please be sure to hit the submit button so that we have your answers recorded. Okay, so at this time the polling form is closed. Again, if you missed the form, please enter the code into the Q&A widget. If you have any difficulty, please email me. And with that, I will turn it back over to Steve to provide some closing statements.
Thanks, Allison. One question I wanted to pose to Nate Beaver concerning the FDA. Nate, you mentioned the rare disease vouchers that are transferable, and some of them have been sold for significant amounts of money. I was curious as to whether anybody who obtains an orphan approval gets one of these vouchers, and whether what does the voucher entitle the holder to do? Why is it so valuable?
Sure, good question. I'll try to be brief. So this voucher program is not for all orphan products, but is only for rare pediatric disease products. And FDA does have some guidance on what that constitutes, but effectively it's rare pediatric diseases. And what the voucher gives a company is the ability to get a priority review of any application that would otherwise be eligible for a standard review. So that means for a product that would be eligible for a 10-month review cycle by FDA, you can hand in that voucher and say to FDA, and it has to be some period in advance, but you give it to FDA and say, we would like to receive a priority review for this particular application, which would otherwise not be eligible for a priority review. So for a particular product, it could mean you could get approval up to 4 months earlier, which certainly for something that you think could be a blockbuster product could be a very significant piece of real estate. And that's why the vouchers, when they have landed on the open market, and as I said, there's been a handful of them, they've gone for up to $350 million in terms of the value of that voucher.
Great. Thanks for the additional comments. With that, I'd like to wrap up because we have gone a few minutes over. And let me thank all of our presenters today and thank the audience for joining us. In this last slide, you'll see our email addresses, and if anybody has questions, they should feel free to contact any of today's presenters for follow-up, and hopefully we've given at least somewhat of a picture of the enormous promise of these emerging technologies in immunotherapy, as well as an appreciation of how they fit into the existing landscape. And we've heard about some of the amazing incentives that exist at the FDA for pursuing these types of approvals, as well as the expedited procedures that the U.S. Patent Office offers for pursuing patent protection in these areas. But at the same time, we've seen some of the challenges on the pricing and reimbursement side. So with that, I will close our session today, and once again, thank you all for joining us.